The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the ballroom as camera flashes erupted like fireworks. Ilara Whitmore stood frozen at the podium, her champagne glass trembling slightly in her manicured hand. The reporter's question hung in the air like smoke from a dying cigarette. "Is it true you're dating a janitor?" Heat flooded her cheeks. Without thinking, her finger pointed toward the back of the room, where a figure in navy blue coveralls was quietly mopping the marble floor. "I would never date a janitor," she declared, her voice carrying further than intended. The man stopped mid-motion, his eyes meeting hers across the crowded room with an expression she would never forget. Ilara Whitmore had built her empire on precision. At 35, she commanded Whitmore timepieces with the same exacting standards her father had instilled in her before his sudden death 5 years ago. Every morning at 6 sharp, she arrived at the gleaming headquarters overlooking Manhattan's Diamond District. Her office walls displayed awards and photographs of her shaking hands with world leaders, each frame positioned at mathematically perfect angles. The company's legacy stretched back 4 generations, but the weight of carrying it forward rested solely on her shoulders. She had learned early that emotions were luxury items she couldn't afford. When her father collapsed in his workshop at 58, clutching his chest while examining a prototype movement, Ilara had been 29 and working in marketing. The board of directors had questioned whether a woman could lead the company. Competitors circled like vultures, sensing weakness. Employees whispered about selling to larger corporations. In response, Ilara had crystallized into something harder than the sapphire crystal protecting their watch faces. Her days followed rigid patterns. Board meetings where she spoke in measured tones about market penetration and profit margins. Client dinners where she smiled at precisely the right moments while discussing Swiss complications and limited editions. Charity galas where she wrote checks for causes she barely had time to understand. She lived in a penthouse apartment filled with museum-quality furniture that remained pristine because she was never home long enough to disturb it. Men approached her regularly, drawn by her success, her beauty, or her bank account. Investment bankers with practiced charm, politicians with calculated smiles, CEOs from other companies seeking strategic alliances through marriage. She dated some of them. Relationships that felt like business negotiations conducted over expensive wine. None had ever seen her cry. None had ever heard her laugh without calculation behind it. None had ever touched the part of her that remembered being 8 years old, sitting on her father's lap while he explained how tiny gears could measure the infinite mystery of time. Meanwhile, 38 floors below, Noah Blake was finishing his shift in a world Ilara never noticed. He moved through the building like a ghost, arriving after the executives had gone home to their suburban mansions and their second wives. His territory included the executive floors, the workshops, and the public showrooms where million-dollar timepieces sat behind bulletproof glass. Noah had not always been invisible. 12 years ago, he had been Noah Blake, master horologist, the youngest craftsman ever admitted to the American Watchmaking Institute. His hands could coax life from the most delicate mechanisms. His workshop in Brooklyn had been small but renowned among collectors who valued artistry over mass production. He had been married to Sarah, a music teacher with gentle eyes and a laugh that made their cramped apartment feel like a palace. Then came the fire. A short circuit in aging wiring had ignited the building at 2 in the morning. Noah had managed to save Mrs. Chen from the apartment next door, carrying the elderly woman down 3 flights of smoke-filled stairs. But he couldn't save his workshop, his tools, his reputation, or his marriage. Sarah had tried to stand by him through the lawsuits and the insurance investigations, but watching him become someone she didn't recognize had slowly broken her spirit. The divorce papers had arrived on the same day Luna took her first steps. Noah had signed them without contest, understanding that Sarah deserved better than the hollow man he had become. But he had fought for joint custody of Luna with everything he had left, which wasn't much. The legal fees had consumed his savings, The stress had consumed his health. Depression had consumed his soul. The janitorial job had been a lifeline thrown by a friend of a friend who remembered Noah from better days. Night shift paid a premium, and the work was honest. More importantly, it allowed him to spend afternoons with Luna when she came home from school. He would pick her up at 3:30, help her with homework at the kitchen table of their studio apartment, make dinner from whatever was on sale at the grocery store, and tuck her into bed with stories about brave princesses and kind dragons before leaving for work at 10 p.m. Luna was 8 now, with Sarah's gentle eyes and Noah's stubborn chin. She never complained about their circumstances, never asked why other children had bigger homes or newer clothes. She made friendship bracelets from scraps of yarn and left them on Noah's pillow with notes that said, "Best Daddy Ever," in her careful cursive handwriting. When Noah came home exhausted at dawn, she would already be awake, making him toast with peanut butter cut into heart shapes. The night of the charity gala, Noah had been working later than usual. A wine spill in the executive dining room had required deep cleaning, and he wanted to finish before the morning staff arrived. He had been focused on removing red stains from imported marble when the sound of his name being discussed made him look up. The aftermath of Ilara's public declaration spread through the building like ripples in still water. By morning, everyone knew. The security guards smirked when he passed. The day-shift cleaning crew avoided eye contact. The executive assistants who had previously ignored him now watched him with a mixture of pity and embarrassment that felt worse than contempt. But Noah said nothing. He had learned years ago that defending himself only made things worse. He simply continued his work, disappearing into the rhythm of routine that had kept him sane through darker times. Mop, rinse, repeat, check the supply closets, empty the trash cans, polish the brass fixtures until they gleamed like mirrors reflecting a life he used to live. After the humiliation of the charity gala, Ilara tried to push the incident from her mind, but the memory clung to her like smoke. She found herself taking different routes through the building to avoid encountering the man she had so thoughtlessly humiliated. When board meetings ran late and she caught glimpses of navy coveralls in the hallway, she felt an unfamiliar sensation in her chest that she couldn't quite name. 3 days after the gala, she was leaving her office near midnight when she noticed something glinting on the marble floor near the elevators. Her father's pocket watch lay where it had fallen from her purse, its gold case scratched from the impact. She had carried it everywhere since his death, though it had stopped working years ago. The watch repair shops she had visited all said the same thing. The mechanism was too old, too damaged. Parts no longer existed. Ilara picked up the watch and held it to her ear out of habit, hearing only silence. The inscription on the back had worn smooth from years of her father's fingers tracing the words, "Time heals all wounds, M.W." Her grandfather had given it to her father on his wedding day. Her father had planned to give it to her future husband someday, but someday had become never when his heart stopped beating. She slipped the watch back into her purse and headed home to her sterile penthouse, where she poured herself a glass of wine. She wouldn't finish and stared out at the city lights until exhaustion finally pulled her towards sleep. The next morning, the watch was ticking. Ilara stared at it in disbelief, holding it to her ear to confirm the steady rhythm she hadn't heard in 5 years. The crystal face was clear, the hands moving with perfect precision. She opened the case and found everything exactly as it should be, except for a tiny engraving on the inside cover that hadn't been there before. Still ticking. N. Her hands trembled as she set the watch on her desk. Someone had taken it, repaired it, and returned it without a word. Someone with extraordinary skill and access to her office. Someone whose initial was N. The security footage told the story. At 2:17 a.m., a figure in navy coveralls had knelt beside the elevators, carefully picking up something from the floor. At 5:43 a.m., the same figure had entered her office with a master key, placed something on her desk, and left as quietly as a shadow. Noah Blake, the man she had publicly declared she would never date, had spent hours of his own time fixing the one thing in her life that couldn't be bought or replaced. The watch her father had treasured, the last connection to a man who had taught her that precision and patience could capture eternity in a mechanism small enough to fit in your palm. Ilara called the head of security and requested Noah's personnel file. The sparse document revealed little. Hired 3 years ago. Excellent performance reviews. No disciplinary actions. Under emergency contacts, there was only one name. Luna Blake. Daughter. Age 8. That afternoon, she found herself studying the building's employee database, searching for more information about the man who had restored her father's most precious possession. The deeper she dug, the more questions arose. Why was someone capable of such delicate work pushing a mop? What had brought him to this building, to this life that seemed so far beneath his abilities? For the first time in years, Ilara found herself genuinely curious about another person's story. The sensation was unsettling and addictive, like the first sip of wine after months of sobriety. She caught herself looking toward the hallways during evening meetings, hoping to catch a glimpse of navy coveralls. When she worked late, she listened for the soft sounds of footsteps and the gentle swoosh of a mop against marble. The watch ticked steadily on her wrist, marking moments she had never noticed before. Each second felt different now, weighted with possibility and questions she didn't know how to ask. Ilara began working later, telling herself it was dedication to quarterly reports and strategic planning. But truthfully, she was hoping to encounter Noah Blake again, to see the man behind the careful gesture that had restored something she thought was lost forever. The opportunity came on a Thursday evening when she emerged from a conference call with Tokyo investors to find Noah polishing the brass handrails outside her office. He looked up when she approached, his expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Blake," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." He straightened, setting down his cloth. "Ma'am?" She held up her wrist, showing him the watch. "Though I suppose it works better now than it ever did when it was truly mine." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The building hummed quietly around them, fluorescent lights casting stark shadows on polished surfaces. Noah's eyes were the color of slate before a storm, and she found herself noticing details she had missed during their brief, humiliating encounter at the gala. The way his work shirt was always perfectly clean despite the nature of his job. The careful precision of his movements. The fact that his hands, though calloused, moved with the grace of someone who had once worked with delicate things. "I'm sorry about taking it," he said finally. "I saw it fall and recognized the maker's mark. 1890 vintage Whitmore movement. One of your great-grandfather's pieces. I couldn't leave it broken." "How did you know what it was?" "I used to work with timepieces." The answer came carefully, like he was revealing a secret he rarely shared. "A long time ago." "What happened?" Noah glanced toward the elevator, clearly wanting to escape this conversation. But something in her tone must have convinced him she was asking out of genuine interest rather than idle curiosity. "Life happened," he said. "Sometimes things break, and you can't fix them. Sometimes you have to start over in a different direction." Ilara nodded, understanding more than he probably realized. She had built her entire existence around the fear of things breaking, of having to start over. But here was a man who had done exactly that and somehow survived. "Thank you," she said, meaning more than just the watch repair. "It means more to me than you could know." "Your father was a good man," Noah said quietly. "He didn't deserve to go so young." The words hit her like a physical blow. "You knew my father?" But Noah was already walking away, his footsteps echoing down the empty corridor. Ilara stood frozen, watching him disappear around the corner, her father's watch ticking steadily against her wrist. like a heartbeat she had forgotten she possessed. That night, she sat in her office long after Noah's shift had ended, staring at old photographs of her father. In several pictures from industry events, she noticed a young man standing slightly behind him, listening intently as her father explained various mechanisms to potential clients. The young man had thick, dark hair and intense eyes that seemed familiar. She pulled out a magnifying glass and studied the photos more closely. There, barely visible on the young man's shirt, was a name tag. Noah Blake, apprentice. The realization struck her like lightning. Noah hadn't just known her father, he had worked for him. He had been part of the Whitmore legacy before everything fell apart, before he became invisible. Over the following days, Elara found herself paying attention to Noah in ways she had never noticed anyone before. She observed how he interacted with other employees, always polite but maintaining careful distance. She watched him work, noting the methodical way he approached each task, the pride he took in details others would never notice. On Friday afternoon, she made a decision that surprised even herself. She left her office early and drove to PS 107, where, according to Noah's file, Luna Blake was a third-grade student. The school was a typical Manhattan elementary building, brick and concrete, surrounded by a small playground. At 3:30, children poured out of the doors like colorful confetti, running toward waiting parents and caregivers. Luna Blake was easy to spot. She had her father's dark hair and the same careful way of observing her surroundings before moving. But where Noah seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders, Luna moved with the light step of someone who still believed in magic. She waited on the front steps, a pink backpack covered in star stickers at her feet, reading a book that looked far too advanced for a third grader. When Noah arrived, jogging slightly because he was a few minutes late, Luna's face transformed into pure sunshine. "Daddy." She launched herself into his arms with the complete trust of a child who had never doubted she was loved. "Sorry, sweetheart. The train was delayed." Noah hugged her tightly, and Elara saw something in his expression she had never witnessed in the corporate world. Unconditional love without agenda or calculation. "It's okay. I finished my math homework while I waited. Want to see?" Luna pulled out a worksheet covered in neat numbers and careful writing. "You're brilliant," Noah said, studying the paper as if it contained the secrets of the universe. "But you know what? I think this answer here might need another look." They sat on the steps together, Luna's head bent close to her father's, as he gently guided her through the problem. Watching them, Elara felt something crack open in her chest. A longing so sharp, it took her breath away. This was what she had been missing all these years while building her empire. This connection, this simplicity, this love that didn't need contracts or negotiations or strategic planning. It just existed, pure and uncomplicated, like the steady ticking of a well-made watch. As Noah and Luna walked hand in hand toward the subway station, Luna skipping slightly to match her father's longer stride, Elara realized she was crying. Not the calculated tears she had shed at her father's funeral, performed for the cameras and the board members who were watching for signs of weakness. These were real tears, salt water carrying years of buried longing. She sat in her expensive car, watching the ordinary miracle of a father and daughter who had found joy despite having lost everything else, and wondered if she had spent her entire adult life optimizing for the wrong variables. The following Monday, Elara did something unprecedented. She left a note on her assistant's desk, requesting that Noah Blake be asked to come to her office at his earliest convenience. The request went through proper channels, causing curious looks and whispered conversations throughout the building. When Noah appeared at her door that evening, still wearing his work uniform, Elara realized she had no idea how to begin the conversation she needed to have. "Please, sit down," she said, gesturing to the leather chair across from her desk. Noah remained standing. Is there a problem with my work, ma'am? No. Your work is exemplary. I wanted to talk to you about something else. She took a breath, steadying herself. I know you worked for my father. For a moment, Noah's carefully composed expression flickered, revealing surprise and something that might have been pain. Then the mask slipped back into place. That was a long time ago. Tell me about it. It wasn't a request. Noah glanced toward the door, clearly calculating escape routes. But something in Ilara's voice, perhaps the fact that she was asking rather than demanding, made him reconsider. I was 26, he said finally, fresh out of horological school, full of ideas about craftsmanship and artistry. Your father took a chance on a kid from Brooklyn who thought he could change the world one gear at a time. What did you do for him? Started in repair. Moved up to restoration of vintage pieces. Eventually, he let me work on some custom commissions. Noah's voice grew softer. Remembering, he was patient with me, even when I made mistakes. Said I had good hands and a better heart. Then what happened? Life happened. The words came out harder than Noah had intended. I left to start my own business. Got married. Had dreams of building something that would last. He paused, struggling with memories he rarely allowed himself to revisit. The fire took everything. My workshop, my tools, my reputation. The insurance company fought the claim. Lawyers got involved. Your father tried to help. Offered me my old job back. But I was too proud, too angry, too broken. Ilara leaned forward, studying his face. He talked about you, you know. After you left, he said you were the most talented craftsman he'd ever trained. He was kind. My father wasn't kind. He was honest. The words carried weight, and Noah looked up to meet her eyes for the first time since entering the office. If he said you were talented, it was because you were. Talent doesn't pay rent or buy groceries for an 8-year-old girl. But it fixed my father's watch. They sat in silence for a moment, the steady ticking of various timepieces around the office marking seconds that felt pregnant with possibility. Why are you asking me this? Noah said finally. Ilara stood and walked to the window overlooking the city. Far below, people moved like ants along sidewalks, each carrying their own stories of triumph and failure, love and loss. Because I've spent 5 years thinking I knew everything about running this company, about carrying on my father's legacy. But I realize I don't know anything about the people who make it possible. I don't know their stories or their dreams or what they've lost along the way. She turned back to face him. And because you gave me back something I thought was gone forever, not just the watch, the memory of my father's voice, telling me that time heals all wounds. I had forgotten that some things are worth waiting for. Noah stood, uncomfortable with the intimacy of the conversation. I should get back to work. Should you? Or do you think there might be another way? Ma'am, I'm offering you a job, Mr. Blake. Not as a janitor, but as what you are. A master horologist, head of our restoration department. Full benefits, salary commensurate with your skills, and flexible hours, so you can still pick up Luna from school. Noah stared at her as if she had spoken in a foreign language. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. The board would never approve. I am the board. This is my company, and I make the decisions about who works here and in what capacity. Ilara moved closer, her voice gaining strength. The question is, are you ready to stop hiding from who you used to be? The question hung between them like a bridge. Noah wasn't sure he was ready to cross. For 3 years, he had found safety in invisibility, in work that required nothing more than showing up and following instructions. The thought of creating again, of risking failure and judgment, terrified him more than poverty ever had. But as he looked at Ilara Whitmore really looked at her, he saw something he recognized. The same fear he carried, hidden behind expensive clothes and corporate success instead of janitor's coveralls and careful silence. "I need to think about it," he said. "Of course. Take all the time you need." As Noah left her office, Alara felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the calculated optimism she brought to board meetings and investor calls, but real hope, fragile and precious as a watch movement, ticking with the rhythm of second chances. But Alara's research into Noah's past had only scratched the surface. Driven by a curiosity she couldn't name, she spent the following week making phone calls and reviewing old files, piecing together the full story of what had happened to her father's most promising apprentice. The truth, when she finally uncovered it, was more complex and heartbreaking than she had imagined. Noah hadn't simply left to start his own business. He had been recruited by Meridian Watch Company, Whitmore's biggest competitor, with an offer that included a signing bonus large enough to pay for his wedding and a down payment on a small workshop. The move had been seen as a betrayal by some in the industry, though her father had publicly wished him well. But the fire that destroyed Noah's workshop hadn't been an accident. According to a police report Alara had to pull strings to access, investigators had found evidence of arson. The primary suspect had been Marcus Chen, a disgruntled former employee of Noah's who had been fired for drinking on the job. Chen had been in the building that night, allegedly retrieving personal belongings. The case had never gone to trial. Chen had died in the fire, overcome by smoke while trying to escape. But not before Noah had carried Mrs. Chen, Marcus's elderly mother who lived in the apartment upstairs, to safety. The woman had survived, but Noah had been injured burns on his hands and arms, smoke inhalation that had left him hospitalized for 2 weeks. During his recovery, the insurance company had begun their investigation. Someone had leaked information suggesting that Noah might have set the fire himself for the insurance money. The accusation was baseless. Noah's policy barely covered his equipment, let alone provided motive for arson. But the suggestion was enough to poison the well of public opinion. Orders were canceled. Clients demanded refunds. Other craftsmen, fearing guilt by association, distanced themselves from Noah. His marriage to Sarah, already strained by financial pressures, and his physical recovery, couldn't survive the social ostracism. The most damaging detail was buried in a file from the insurance company's private investigator. Marcus Chen had been secretly working for Meridian Watch Company, feeding them information about Noah's client list and techniques. The fire had been intended to destroy evidence of industrial espionage, not to harm anyone. But Noah had never known this. He had spent 12 years believing that his former employee had died, trying to rob him, carrying the guilt of a man's death alongside the loss of everything else he had valued. Alara sat in her office at 2 in the morning, surrounded by documents and police reports, trying to process what she had learned. Her father had tried to help Noah after the fire, offering him work and financial support. But Noah had been too broken, too proud, and too consumed by guilt to accept charity from his former mentor. The final piece of the puzzle came from her father's personal files, stored in a safe she had never opened. Among his papers, she found a folder labeled NB Restoration Fund, containing $25,000 in cash, and a letter dated just 2 weeks before her father's death. If you're reading this, the letter began in her father's careful handwriting. It means I didn't get the chance to make things right with Noah Blake. The money in this envelope represents commissions he earned but never collected, plus interest, plus my own attempt to repay a debt I've carried for 5 years. Noah Blake was the finest craftsman I ever trained, and I failed him when he needed me most. I knew about Marcus Chen's arrangement with Meridian. I had proof of the industrial espionage, proof that would have cleared Noah's name and restored his reputation. But I kept quiet to protect a business relationship that seemed more important at the time than one young man's future. I've regretted that decision every day since. If something happens to me before I can make amends, I'm trusting you to find a way to give Noah back what he lost, not just the money, but his place in this industry and his belief in his own worth." The letter was signed and dated, witnessed by her father's attorney. Legal proof of Noah's innocence and her father's guilt, a guilt he had carried to his grave. Alara called in sick for the first time in 5 years and spent the day walking through Central Park, trying to understand how a single decision could ripple through so many lives. Her father, whom she had idolized, had been human, after all, capable of moral failure and petty selfishness. Noah, whom she had seen as a victim of circumstance, had been the target of a deliberate conspiracy. And she, in her ignorance and arrogance, had perpetuated the injustice by treating him as invisible. That evening, she waited in the lobby until Noah arrived for his shift. When he saw her, his expression immediately became guarded. "Miss Whitmore, has something happened? We need to talk." "Not in my office, somewhere private." "Please." They walked to a 24-hour diner 6 blocks away, sliding into a booth in the back corner where the fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows, and the coffee was strong enough to strip paint. Alara had never been in a place like this, but it felt appropriate for the conversation they needed to have. She laid the documents on the table between them. Police reports, insurance files, her father's letter, and the envelope of money. "I know what really happened," she said simply. Noah's face went white as he recognized the official letterheads and saw his own name typed across multiple pages. His hands trembled as he picked up her father's letter, reading it slowly, his expression cycling through disbelief, anger, and something that might have been relief. "He knew," Noah whispered. The 42nd floor conference room glowed in the evening light as Celeste Hawthorne studied her chessboard alone. The soft knock interrupted her concentration. "Come in," she called without looking up. A tall janitor in coveralls entered, pushing his cleaning cart quietly. Something about the chess position caught his attention, and she noticed him watching. On impulse, driven by loneliness or arrogance, she smirked and made an offer that would change everything. "Beat me in chess, and I'll marry you." The man stopped, looked directly at her with serious gray-green eyes, and replied, "My name is Liam, and I play for real." Celeste Hawthorne had ruled her corner of the business world for over a decade, building her father's modest consulting firm into a multinational powerhouse through sheer force of will and an intellect that cut through boardroom politics like a blade. At 35, she had everything she'd ever wanted: respect, success, and enough money to buy anything except the one thing that had always eluded her. Love had proven to be a luxury she couldn't afford. Not when every relationship crumbled under the weight of her ambition or dissolved in the acid of others' jealousy over her success. Men either wanted to conquer her or be conquered by her, and she'd grown tired of both games long ago. The chess set before her was a relic from her father, carved from ebony and ivory, each piece a small work of art. She'd learned the game at his knee, back when his approval still mattered, before cancer took him and left her alone with an empire she'd never asked for but couldn't bear to lose. Now chess was her meditation, her escape from the endless demands of leadership. In the 64 squares of the board, she found a purity that the corporate world lacked. Every move had consequences, every decision mattered, and victory belonged to those who thought furthest ahead. Liam Carter existed in a different universe entirely. One measured not in quarterly profits, but in small victories and daily survival. At 39, he moved through the gleaming towers of downtown with the invisible efficiency of the working class, his presence noted only when something went wrong. His broad shoulders carried more than just the weight of industrial cleaning equipment. They bore the hopes and fears of a man who'd sacrificed everything for his daughter's future. The chess world knew him once as a prodigy, a teenager who danced across tournament boards with the grace of a poet and the killer instinct of a predator. But that was before Sarah died, before 8-year-old Emma's asthma attacks began stealing her breath in the middle of the night, before the medical bills, and the sleepless vigils, and the realization that genius meant nothing if you couldn't protect the people you loved. Now he cleaned offices for $12 an hour plus benefits, the kind of steady work that came with health insurance and predictable schedules. His former life felt like a dream he'd once had, beautiful and distant, and utterly irrelevant to the man he'd become. Emma Carter was the brightest star in her father's reduced universe, a precocious 8-year-old with her mother's gentle spirit and her father's quick mind. Her asthma had been manageable until recently, but the attacks were growing more frequent, more severe, each one a reminder of how fragile their carefully constructed life really was. She didn't remember much about her mother, but she remembered the chess set that still sat on their kitchen table. The one her father would stare at sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, his fingers tracing the pieces like old friends he'd lost touch with. The apartment they shared was modest but clean, filled with Emma's artwork and the quiet desperation of a single parent trying to make everything seem normal when nothing felt secure. The conference room seemed to shrink around them as Liam approached the chess table with measured steps. Celeste had expected him to laugh, to make some self-deprecating comment about not knowing how the pieces moved, to restore the natural order of their respective worlds. Instead, he was studying the board with the focused intensity of a surgeon examining an X-ray, his large hands hovering over the pieces with surprising delicacy. "You're playing the Queen's Gambit," he observed, settling into the chair across from her with an ease that suggested he belonged there. "Declined. Classical variation. You favor control over tactical complications." It wasn't a question, and the accuracy of his assessment made something flutter in Celeste's chest, surprise, perhaps, or the first stirring of genuine interest she'd felt in years. "You seem to know your way around a board," she replied, trying to maintain her casual tone while reassessing the man across from her. Up close, she could see the intelligence in his eyes, the careful way he held himself, as if he was used to being underestimated. "Are you sure you want to take me up on this?" "I don't lose often." Liam smiled, and it transformed his entire face. "Neither do I," he said simply, reaching for the white queen's pawn. "Shall we reset the board?" What followed was the most intense chess game of Celeste's life. Liam played with a fluid grace that spoke of years of serious study, each move flowing naturally from the last, as if he were reading from a script only he could see. His opening was classical, but creative, establishing control of the center while keeping his real intentions hidden. Celeste found herself leaning forward, her usual confidence evaporating as she realized she was facing a player of genuine skill. By the 10th move, she knew she was in trouble. By the 15th, she was fighting for her life on the board. Liam's pieces moved with surgical precision, each capture and advance part of a larger pattern that was only now becoming clear. He wasn't just playing chess, he was conducting a symphony of strategy that built toward an inevitable crescendo. "Check," Liam said softly, his knight finding a square that seemed to appear from nowhere. Celeste stared at the board, her mind racing through possible defenses, each one crumbling under analysis. She moved her king to safety, but even as she did, she could see the walls closing in around her. "Check," he said again, a different piece this time, the attack coming from an angle she hadn't anticipated. Her palms were actually sweating now, something that hadn't happened since her first major presentation to the board of directors 15 years ago. The third check came like a thunderclap. "Checkmate," Liam announced, though his tone held no triumph, only a quiet satisfaction. The position was elegant in its brutality, her king trapped in a web of his pieces, no escape possible, the game over in exactly 21 moves. The board seemed to mock her as she stared at the final position, every piece a testament to her complete and utter defeat. Celeste Hawthorne, who had built an empire through careful calculation and strategic thinking, had been outmaneuvered by a man whose existence she'd barely acknowledged 5 minutes earlier. The Ivory King lay on its side where she'd tipped it in surrender, and somehow that small gesture felt like the most honest thing she'd done in years. "You hustled me," she said finally, her voice carrying a brittleness she didn't recognize. The words came out sharper than she'd intended, tinged with an anger that was directed more at herself than at him. "You let me think you were just some random guy who happened to know how the pieces moved." Liam began resetting the board with careful, practiced movements, each piece finding its starting square with the precision of a ritual. "I never said I was just some random guy," he replied evenly. "You assumed that, because of what I do for work, there's a difference." The distinction hit her like a slap, forcing her to confront the casual arrogance that had led her to this moment. She'd looked at his coveralls and his cleaning cart and reduced him to a stereotype, never imagining that intelligence might exist outside the narrow confines of her corporate world. The realization was uncomfortable, like discovering a blind spot in her peripheral vision that had been there all along. "Where did you learn to play like that?" she asked, genuine curiosity overriding her wounded pride. "That wasn't luck or beginner's fortune. You dismantled me systematically." Liam finished placing the last pawn and looked up at her with those unsettling gray-green eyes. "I had some good teachers when I was younger," he said, and she caught something in his tone that suggested a story with depths she couldn't fathom. "Chess was my life once, before other things became more important." The phrase hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made her want to ask a dozen follow-up questions. But before she could form the words, Liam was rising from his chair, pushing the cleaning cart toward the door with the same quiet efficiency that had brought him into her orbit. "Thank you for the game, Miss Hawthorne," he said formally. "I should finish my rounds." Celeste watched him leave, her mind churning with questions she didn't know how to ask. The conference room felt different now, smaller somehow, as if his presence had expanded the space and his absence left it diminished. She looked down at the reset board, the pieces arranged in their eternal starting positions, and felt an unfamiliar hollow sensation in her chest. For the rest of the week, she found herself thinking about the quiet janitor who had humiliated her so thoroughly and so gracefully. It was her assistant's offhand comment about needing to update the building's service contractor database that gave her the excuse she needed. Employee background checks were a routine part of corporate security, she told herself, even as she pulled up Liam Carter's file on her computer late one Thursday evening. What she found there made her lean back in her chair as if she'd been physically struck. The basic information was unremarkable: 39 years old, widowed, one dependent child, clean driving record, no criminal history. But buried in the employment history section was a single line that changed everything. Previous occupation: professional chess player. USCF rating 2,437. Her hands trembled as she cross-referenced that rating with the official Chess Federation databases. The numbers told a story that left her breathless with disbelief and something approaching awe. Liam Carter hadn't just been a professional chess player, he'd been a genuine prodigy, a teenager who dominated the national junior circuits in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Tournament reports from 20 years ago described him as brilliant and fearless, a tactical genius with an intuitive understanding of complex positions. The deeper she dug, the more remarkable his story became. International master at 16, barely missing his grandmaster norms due to a family tragedy that had pulled him away from competitive play just as he was reaching his peak. There were forum posts from chess enthusiasts wondering whatever happened to that Carter kid who could have been the next Fischer. Speculation about a promising career cut short by mysterious circumstances. The mystery was solved in a death certificate she found through public records. Sarah Elizabeth Carter, age 29. Breast cancer, survived by husband Liam and daughter Emma. The date was 7 years ago, which meant he'd been caring for a terminally ill wife and a toddler when he'd walked away from professional chess forever. The sacrifice was staggering in its completeness. He'd given up not just a career, but an entire identity, transforming himself from a rising star into a custodian for the sake of his family's survival. Celeste found herself staring at tournament photographs from his glory days, studying the intense young man with the fierce eyes and the confident smile. That version of Liam Carter had inhabited a world of international travel and corporate sponsorships, magazine interviews, and appearance fees that could have set him up for life. He'd traded all of it for health insurance and a steady paycheck, becoming invisible so his daughter could breathe. The weight of her earlier dismissiveness settled on her like a physical burden. She'd looked at his work clothes and his quiet demeanor and assumed he was intellectually beneath her, never imagining that he'd sacrificed more than she'd ever achieved. The man who'd beaten her so effortlessly had been playing chess at the highest levels when she was still learning to read corporate balance sheets. More than that, he'd given up greatness for love. Something she'd never understood, because she'd never loved anyone more than she loved success. The next morning found her distracted and restless, unable to focus on the stream of meetings and decisions that normally consumed her attention. She'd planned to seek him out directly, to apologize for her assumptions and perhaps challenge him to another game. But fate intervened in the form of a medical emergency that would strip away the last of her pretenses. She was leaving the building around 6 in the evening when she heard the commotion in the parking garage. A man's voice, tight with panic, talking rapidly to what sounded like an emergency dispatcher. Following the sound, she found Liam kneeling beside a small girl who was struggling to breathe, her lips tinged with blue, her eyes wide with the particular terror of someone drowning in air. "Emma, baby, just try to relax," Liam was saying, his voice steady, despite the fear radiating from every line of his body. "The ambulance is coming, okay? Daddy's right here." In his hand was an inhaler that clearly wasn't providing enough relief, and Celeste could see the desperation in his movements as he tried to position his daughter to ease her breathing. Without thinking, Celeste dropped her briefcase and pulled out her phone. "This is Celeste Hawthorne," she said to the emergency operator in the voice that had commanded boardrooms for 15 years. "I need an ambulance at the Hawthorne Building parking garage immediately. We have a child in severe respiratory distress, and I'm authorizing the use of my company's helipad for emergency medical transport if necessary." The next hour passed in a blur of paramedics and oxygen tanks, of Liam's white face as he climbed into the ambulance beside his daughter's stretcher, of Celeste following in her own car, because somehow leaving felt impossible. At the hospital, she found herself in the uncomfortable position of being simultaneously essential and utterly useless. Her insurance information and emergency authorizations smoothed Emma's path through triage, but she could only watch helplessly as Liam disappeared behind the doors of the pediatric emergency department. She waited in the family lounge, surrounded by the particular mixture of hope and despair that hospitals cultivated, checking her phone every few minutes for updates she knew wouldn't come. When Liam finally emerged 3 hours later, his face was drawn with exhaustion but no longer shadowed by panic. "Emma was stable," he reported, responding well to the nebulizer treatments, likely to be discharged in the morning if her oxygen levels remained steady. "Thank you," he said simply. And she could see in his eyes that he understood exactly what her intervention had meant. They spent the next week finding excuses to encounter each other, casual meetings that felt anything but accidental. Celeste began taking coffee breaks in the building's lobby during Liam's afternoon shift, ostensibly reviewing reports but really hoping to catch glimpses of him as he worked. He, in turn, seemed to find reasons to clean the executive floors more frequently. Their conversations developing the easy rhythm of two people discovering they genuinely enjoyed each other's company. The change in Celeste was subtle but profound, noticed first by her assistant and then by the senior partners who'd grown accustomed to her Arctic professional demeanor. She smiled more, laughed occasionally at meetings, seemed somehow more present in conversations instead of calculating 3 moves ahead. The transformation was attractive in ways that had nothing to do with her appearance, and everything to do with the emergence of a warmth that had been buried under years of corporate armor. For Liam, the friendship represented a different kind of revelation. He'd grown so accustomed to being invisible, to having his intelligence and his history dismissed or ignored, that Celeste's genuine interest in his thoughts and opinions felt like stepping into sunlight after years in shadow. She asked about his daughter with real curiosity, about his chess background without condescension, about his current work with the respect accorded to honest labor honestly performed. Emma, for her part, had begun asking questions about Daddy's friend from work, the pretty lady who'd helped at the hospital, and who somehow made her father's face soften when he mentioned her. Children had an intuitive understanding of their parents' emotional weather, and Emma could sense the subtle shift in Liam's daily mood, the way he seemed lighter and more hopeful than he'd been since her mother's death. The three of them began spending time together outside the sterile confines of office buildings and medical facilities. Saturday afternoon trips to the park where Emma could play while the adults talked. Casual dinners at family restaurants, where Celeste marveled at the easy intimacy between father and daughter. Movie nights at Liam's modest apartment, where she learned to navigate the complex negotiations required to find films suitable for an 8-year-old's viewing. Celeste discovered that she genuinely enjoyed Emma's company, finding in the child's bright curiosity and unguarded affection something she'd forgotten she was missing. Emma, in turn, was fascinated by this glamorous woman who dressed like a princess but talked to her like an equal, who knew about boardrooms and business deals, but also remembered what it was like to be 8 years old and full of questions about the world. The growing closeness between them felt natural and inevitable, like the organic development of a chess position where every move flowed logically from the last. But their private happiness was about to collide with the public scrutiny that came with Celeste's prominence, setting in motion a series of events that would test the foundation of everything they were building together. The video appeared on the company's internal social media platform on a Tuesday morning, posted by Marcus Webb, a junior associate in the accounting department who'd been working late the previous week. The footage was grainy, shot through the glass wall of the conference room on his phone, but the audio was clear enough. Celeste's voice making her reckless offer, Liam's measured response, the intensity of their chess game compressed into 90 seconds of corporate drama. The caption read, "When the CEO promises to marry the janitor if he beats her at chess, and he actually does it in 3 moves, is this legally binding?" The post was tagged with laughing emojis and shared across departments with the viral enthusiasm that only workplace gossip could generate. By noon, the video had been viewed by half the company and forwarded to dozens of personal accounts. The comment thread grew like a malignant tumor, filled with speculation about Celeste's personal life, jokes about office romances, and increasingly pointed questions about whether company policy had been violated. The Human Resources Department fielded 17 calls before lunch, most of them requesting clarification about fraternization policies and executive conduct standards. Celeste first learned about the video when her assistant knocked on her office door with an expression that suggested incoming disaster. "Miss Hawthorne, we have a situation," Jennifer began carefully. "There's a video circulating on the company platform. It shows you playing chess with one of the maintenance staff. The content is generating discussion." The blood drained from Celeste's face as she watched the footage, seeing her moment of impulsive flirtation transformed into public spectacle. The comments were worse than the video itself, a toxic mixture of sexism and classism that reduced her to a caricature and dismissed Liam as a gold digger seeking to exploit her wealth and position. The professional persona she'd spent decades crafting was being dissected by people who knew nothing about her life or her choices. Her phone rang constantly throughout the afternoon, board members expressing concern about corporate image, business partners making carefully worded inquiries about her judgment, reporters from the business press hoping to transform workplace gossip into a story about executive impropriety. Each conversation chipped away at her composure, forcing her to defend decisions she wasn't sure she understood herself. The worst call came from Richard Hawthorne, her uncle and the chairman of the board, whose disapproval carried the weight of family disappointment and fiduciary responsibility. Celeste, what the hell is this nonsense about marrying the janitor? The board is concerned about your judgment. This kind of publicity could damage our reputation with clients. It was a joke. Richard? She said tightly, hating the defensive tone in her own voice. A casual comment taken out of context by someone with too much time and too little discretion. It doesn't look casual in the video, he replied coldly. It looks like you're making a mockery of your position and the company's dignity. That evening, she confronted Liam in the building's service elevator, her composure finally cracking under the accumulated weight of public humiliation and professional pressure. The man who'd seemed so noble and principled in the hospital now looked to her like a potential opportunist, someone who might have orchestrated the entire situation for personal gain. "Did you know?" she demanded without preamble. "Did you know that little weasel was recording us? Was this all some elaborate scheme to embarrass me, or leverage yourself into a better situation?" Liam's face went carefully blank, the expression of someone who'd learned to weather accusations without fighting back. "No," he said simply. "I didn't know anyone was recording. I don't want anything from you except your friendship, which I'm apparently about to lose." "My friendship?" The words came out sharper than she'd intended, edged with the particular cruelty that came from lashing out at the person closest to the source of pain. "Is that what you call it when you humiliate someone in front of their entire company? When you make them look like a fool who can't even tell when they're being hustled?" "I never hustled you," Liam replied quietly. "I played chess, the same way I've played it for 20 years. You offered something you didn't mean, and I won a game you didn't expect to lose. That's not a con. It's just what happened." The reasonableness of his response only inflamed her anger further, making her feel petty and irrational in comparison to his calm dignity. "Right. The noble janitor, who's too pure to take advantage of a situation. You must be laughing at all of us, the rich idiots, who never suspected that the help might have actual brains." Something flickered in Liam's eyes then, the first crack in his carefully maintained composure. "You want to know what I'm laughing at? I'm laughing at myself for thinking you were different, for believing that someone who built an empire might understand what it means to sacrifice everything for the people you love. But you're just like the rest of them. Everything's a transaction. Everyone's got an angle, and God forbid anyone should exist outside the neat little boxes you've created for them." The elevator reached the ground floor and opened with a mechanical ding that sounded like a death knell. Liam stepped out without looking back, leaving Celeste alone with the echo of his words and the growing realization that she'd just destroyed the best thing that had happened to her in years. The next few days passed in a blur of damage control and corporate crisis management. The video was removed from the company platform, but had already been copied and shared across social media, taking on a life of its own beyond the confines of corporate gossip. Celeste threw herself into work with renewed intensity, staying late to avoid the sympathetic looks of her staff and the speculative whispers that followed her through the halls. She didn't see Liam again until the following Thursday, when Emma's asthma attacked with a viciousness that sent them racing back to the emergency room. The call came to her office at 2 in the afternoon, Liam's voice tight with controlled panic, asking if her insurance authorization was still valid, if she could help them navigate the system one more time. Celeste was in her car before he finished speaking, driving through downtown traffic with the single-minded focus of someone who'd finally identified what actually mattered. She found them in the pediatric ward, Emma hooked to oxygen and looking impossibly small in the hospital bed, Liam holding her hand and trying to read her a story while she struggled to breathe. The sight of his tears, silent, desperate, utterly unguarded, hit her like a physical blow. This was what real fear looked like. What genuine love demanded. What it meant to have someone else's life matter more than your own pride or professional reputation. Standing in that sterile room, watching a father's heart break over his daughter's labored breathing, Celeste finally understood the magnitude of her own selfishness. She stayed through the night, not because her presence was needed, but because leaving felt impossible. Emma's condition stabilized around dawn, the oxygen levels climbing back into safe territory, the color returning to her lips as the medications did their work. But the crisis had revealed something that couldn't be medicated away. The little girl was getting worse. Her episodes more frequent and severe, her tiny body losing the battle against a condition that no amount of love could cure. "The doctor wants to discuss more aggressive treatment options," Liam said quietly, as they sat in the family lounge, both of them exhausted beyond the point of maintaining social pretenses. "Experimental therapies, specialists in other cities. The kind of care that costs more than I make in 5 years." Celeste wanted to offer money, to write checks that would solve the immediate problem, but she could see in his face that charity would only drive him further away. Instead, she asked the harder question, "What can I do?" "Nothing," he said, but without bitterness. "This isn't a problem you can fix, Celeste. Some things just are what they are." The acceptance in his voice made her chest ache with unshed tears. She'd spent her entire adult life believing that every problem had a solution, that enough money or influence or strategic thinking could overcome any obstacle. But here was a man she cared about, facing a situation that couldn't be managed or negotiated or bought off. And her helplessness was complete. "I'm sorry," she said finally, the words carrying years of accumulated regret. "For what I said in the elevator. For assuming the worst about you. For being exactly the kind of person you thought I was." Liam looked at her with those gray-green eyes that saw too much. "You were scared," he said simply. "People say things they don't mean when they're scared. I understand that. Do you forgive me? There's nothing to forgive. You reacted the way anyone in your position would react. I just hoped you might be different." The quiet devastation in his voice was worse than anger would have been, a recognition that she'd failed to live up to some standard she hadn't even known existed. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, to explain the pressures that had driven her to lash out, but all of those explanations felt like excuses in the face of his daughter's struggle to breathe. That afternoon, Celeste made a decision that would have surprised anyone who knew her professional reputation for calculated risk assessment. She drove to Liam's apartment complex, a modest collection of buildings that housed the working families who kept the city running, and knocked on his door with no plan beyond the need to try again. Emma answered, looking pale but alert, her breathing easier than it had been in the hospital. "Hi, Miss Celeste," she said with the shy smile that never failed to melt something in Celeste's chest. "Daddy's in the kitchen making grilled cheese. Do you want some?" The domestic normalcy of the scene, father cooking, daughter playing, the comfortable chaos of a life lived on love rather than profit margins, made Celeste's throat tight with emotion. This was what she'd been afraid of losing to corporate gossip and professional judgment. This small pocket of warmth in a world that had grown increasingly cold around her. Liam emerged from the kitchen with a questioning look, but Emma had already taken Celeste's hand and was leading her to the table where the chess set still sat in its place of honor. "Daddy taught me some moves," the little girl announced proudly. "Want to see?" What followed was the most important chess lesson of Celeste's life, though it had nothing to do with strategy or tactics. Emma played with the unself-conscious joy of someone for whom the game was pure pleasure, making moves that violated every principle of sound chess, but somehow captured the essence of what made the game beautiful. She narrated her thinking out loud, creating elaborate stories for the pieces, turning the ancient battle into a fairy tale where the pawns were brave peasants and the queen was a benevolent ruler who protected everyone. "You're not playing to win," Celeste observed. Not critically, but with genuine curiosity. "Winning's not the fun part," Emma replied seriously. "The fun part is all the things that happen before someone wins. The simple wisdom of the statement hit Celeste like a revelation. She'd spent so many years focused on outcomes, quarterly results, market share, competitive advantage, that she'd forgotten to notice the texture of the experience itself. Chess with Emma wasn't about demonstrating superiority or achieving victory. It was about connection, imagination, the shared pleasure of two minds meeting across 64 squares. When Liam joined them at the table an hour later, the three of them began a different kind of game entirely. They played team chess, with Emma advising both sides, creating positions that were tactically nonsensical but rich with narrative possibility. They invented new rules, made up stories about the pieces, turned the royal game into something playful and collaborative rather than competitive and zero-sum. "I brought something," Celeste said eventually, pulling a small wrapped package from her purse. Inside was a chess set carved from beautiful maple and walnut, each piece a work of art that caught the afternoon light streaming through the apartment windows. "I thought Emma might like her own set." Emma's eyes went wide with delight as she lifted each piece, examining the intricate details with the reverence of someone who understood that she was holding something precious. "They're so beautiful," she whispered, tracing the carved mane of a knight with one small finger. "Are they really for me?" "They're really for you," Celeste confirmed, feeling a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the child's gratitude and everything to do with the simple joy of giving without expectation of return. "Your dad tells me you're getting pretty good at the game." Liam watched the exchange with an expression that cycled through surprise, appreciation, and something deeper that made Celeste's pulse quicken. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly, but she could hear in his voice that he understood the gesture for what it was. Not charity, but an offering, a bridge across the chasm her words had created between them. "I wanted to," she replied, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since the hospital. "I've been thinking about what you said, about sacrifice and what really matters. I think I've been playing the wrong game for a very long time." They talked as Emma explored her new chess set, arranging and rearranging the pieces in patterns that pleased her artistic sensibilities rather than any strategic logic. The conversation was tentative at first, both of them careful to avoid the landmines of their recent conflict, but gradually it found its natural rhythm. Liam spoke about his plans for Emma's care, the specialists he'd consulted, the delicate balance between hope and financial reality that governed their daily decisions. Celeste found herself opening up about the pressures of corporate leadership in ways she'd never done with anyone, the isolation that came with being responsible for hundreds of jobs and millions of dollars in shareholder value. She talked about the video and its aftermath, the way it had stripped away her carefully constructed professional image and forced her to confront who she really was beneath the executive armor. "The board is considering my position," she admitted, the words feeling strange in her mouth. "Richard thinks I've damaged the company's reputation." "Maybe he's right. Are you afraid of losing your job?" Liam asked, genuine concern in his voice. Celeste considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, the possibility would have terrified her, representing the collapse of everything she'd worked to build. But sitting in this modest apartment, watching Emma play with her chess set while her father worried about medical bills, she found that her priorities had shifted in ways she was only beginning to understand. "I'm afraid of losing this," she said quietly, gesturing to encompass the three of them, the warmth of the afternoon light, the comfortable domesticity that had somehow become more precious to her than any corporate achievement. The final scene unfolded 2 months later in the backyard of the house they'd bought together, a modest but comfortable place with enough room for Emma to play, and a garden where Celeste was learning to grow things other than profit margins. The chess set sat on the patio table between them, the pieces catching the golden light of a Sunday afternoon as they played their weekly game. It had become a ritual, these Sunday matches, less about competition than about the simple pleasure of spending time together, of watching Emma read in the afternoon sun, while they moved pieces across the familiar battlefield of 64 squares. The transformation in all their lives had been gradual but profound, marked not by dramatic gestures but by the accumulation of small moments like this one. "Your move," Liam said, leaning back in his chair with the relaxed confidence of a man who'd found his place in the world. His face had lost the haunted quality that had marked it during Emma's worst episodes, replaced by something that looked almost like contentment. The new medications were working. The specialists Celeste's connections had recommended were optimistic about Emma's long-term prognosis, and for the first time in years, he could imagine a future that extended beyond the next medical crisis. Celeste studied the board, not calculating 3 moves ahead but simply enjoying the moment. The warm pressure of Emma's head against her shoulder, as the little girl read quietly in her lap. The position was complex but not critical, the kind of game where the pleasure lay in the playing rather than the winning. She'd learned to appreciate these drawn-out, meandering matches that could last for hours, punctuated by conversation and laughter, and the occasional interruption from Emma, who had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about sharing them. "If I make this move," she said, indicating a knight that would fork his king and queen in a combination she'd been setting up for the last 10 moves, "and you respond the way I think you will, I might actually beat you for once." It was a running joke between them. Her perpetual quest to defeat the man who'd checkmated her in 3 moves on their first encounter. She'd come close a few times, had even managed to secure a few draws, but Liam's chess intuition remained as sharp as ever, honed by years of high-level competition that muscle memory couldn't forget. "Might," Liam agreed with a smile that made her heart skip the way it had on that first evening, when he'd looked up from the reset board, and she'd seen past his coveralls to the brilliant mind beneath. "Or I might surprise you. I've been known to do that." Emma looked up from her book with the serious expression she wore when dispensing important wisdom, a look that never failed to remind Celeste of her father's intensity tempered by her own natural optimism. "Maybe you could both win," she suggested. A sentiment that had become something of a family motto. Maybe winning isn't about the chess game at all. Celeste and Liam exchanged glances across the board, both understanding that their daughter, because that's what Emma had become, officially and emotionally, had once again identified the essential truth that adults sometimes missed in their focus on competition and achievement. The game they were really playing had nothing to do with 64 squares and everything to do with building a life worth living, piece by careful piece, move by thoughtful move. "You know what?" Celeste said, reaching across the table to take Liam's hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of honest work and the strength that had carried them all through the difficult months of adjustment and healing. "I think she's right. I think we both already won." The chess pieces sat forgotten as the 3 of them dissolved into laughter, the sound carrying across their small backyard like a promise of all the games yet to be played, all the victories yet to be shared, all the love yet to be discovered in the simple act of choosing each other, one move at a time. The afternoon light filtered through the maple tree they'd planted together last spring, casting dappled shadows across the board where their unfinished game waited patiently for their return. But for now, the real game, the one that mattered most, was already won, played out not in the movement of carved pieces across a checkered battlefield, but in the quiet moments of ordinary happiness that had become the true measure of their success.